Okay, so we're going to be talking Kentucky education performance for the 2022-2023 season. And to begin, I don't really have a lot I can say with a lot of confidence about what's going on for some very interesting reasons. The problem is in 2022, Kentucky adopted a totally new state assessment program, which is now called the Kentucky Summative Assessments. It's different enough from the old KPREP, the Kentucky Performance Rating for Educational Progress Assessments that were used up until 2019, that the Kentucky Department of Education says you can't compare the new Kentucky Summative Assessment scores to the old KPREP scores. So another trend line, once again, has been destroyed. Now, to be fair in part, the department was planning to update the assessment before COVID hit. COVID threw some extra monkey wrenches in the works. But as a result of this, the state assessment program technically does not allow you to compare pre-COVID results to post-COVID results. That's right out of the Kentucky Department of Education. They said the scores aren't comparable. So I don't have a trend line. The only thing that's left for us is two other testing programs. One is the federally operated National Assessment of Educational Progress. Everybody calls it the NAEP from its initials, NAEP. And that has been consistently administered for math and reading here in Kentucky for a number of years. There's some limitations with that assessment. It only looks at a sample of students, and it only looks at them every other year, only in the fourth and eighth grades. So it's not anywhere near as comprehensive a look as we would get with the Kentucky Summative Assessments, which look at grades 3 through 8 and high school grades. But that's consistent. So we have consistent NAEP stuff. And we also have testing with the ACT college entrance test for all 11th graders in Kentucky's public schools, which we've been doing back since about 2008. And they changed the reporting format a little bit for ACT in 2013. But since then, the ACT has been pretty stable for administration. So we have that trend line. We'll talk about those later. But with the new program, as you probably already heard, instead of the star ratings that we used to have, now it's colors. And it's 5 colors instead of, I don't know, 5 stars or 4 stars. So what's the difference? It's some different physical thing that's not necessarily a number as opposed to most of us think of when we think of scores, we'd like to see a number. The problem is they started the color rating scheme last year with the Kentucky Summative Assessments program, but they didn't have any trend data. And so they only looked at the status scores. In other words, the scores for the current year, that's the status. But they didn't have any trends. This year, they were able to add the trend information from 2022 to 2023, and they completely revised the way the color scheme scoring works. So you can't compare the colors for this year to the colors from last year, at least not intelligently. Although I have seen at least one school district where they went ahead and did it anyway, even though it doesn't make any sense. But 2022 colors right up next to the 2023 colors for each school. So as far as the state assessment program goes, I haven't spent a lot of time with it because I have to see trend lines. We simply don't have anything that's valid.
I'd say I find it completely irresponsible for them to not make the data traceable and comparable when all we see is learning loss in headlines. We see money from the federal government attached to learning loss. Like all they talk about is learning loss, but then you're not giving us a way to compare data. I just find it very irresponsible.
It's very irritating at the least. By the way, that national program, the NAEP, they have made changes all the time as well, but they usually run a comparison group testing some with the old system, some with the new system when they make a change to try to see what kind of impact those changes really have and whether or not the scores should be considered comparable or not. Obviously, we have nothing like that for the Kentucky testing program. That's the way it should have been done, but that's not the way it was done. So you're right, Stacy. Not a very good thing. The problems we do have with the color grading scheme that I'll point out is that it's based on an average of a number of different things. There are different summative assessments, for example, for math and for reading, social studies and for science and for writing mechanics and so forth. And they all get averaged together. The problem with doing that is if you have one area that's really bad, it just gets hidden by all the others. So you can have a school that does a disastrous job, say science or math or reading, and you may not see it in the overall scores. You've got to drill down on your own and learn a lot more before you really start to get a feel for how the school is performing. So my caution is don't rely on those overall color schemes to tell you very much. You got to drill down. You got to look at individual subject performance. They also add in other stuff. The high schools, for example, they add in graduation rates and the success in preparing for college or career information. That can get to be somewhat subjective, and it's just more stuff that can hide the fact that your math performance in a certain high school is abysmal. So drill down and get into the data, and it's harder to find it, but it's out there. As far as I'm concerned, if you've got problems in math or reading in particular, I think there should be a flag in the system. I don't think you should be able to get a very high color result overall if your math is atrocious, even if you do a stellar job teaching reading and science and the other stuff. But that's not in the system right now. So parents, if you really want to know what's going on in your school, you got to dig deeper, ask questions about detailed subject performance. They have that data. They should share it with you. It is public and for the overall school averages. Okay, one of the things that the federal government requires us to do is to identify comprehensive support and improvement schools, CSI schools. So they didn't do it this year. They've changed that around too, where now they're only going to identify them every 3 years. So what we have is we have some schools that improved enough to get out of the CSI, but we don't have any new ones going in. That doesn't mean that we're doing that much better. It just means they're not going to tell us what's happening for a couple more years. So don't get overly impressed by a reduction in CSI. There's another thing closely related to it, the targeted support and improvement schools. And they did identify some of those again this year, and you can find that in the reports. I won't go into it. But if you have a targeted school, they're going to get targeted for some specific reason, like low performance in academics. Pay attention and again find out why that is, because there's blending going on there too, and it might not be quite apparent that maybe they're doing an atrocious job in math. You'll have to dig down to find that out.
Boone County schools had 14 TSI schools down to now we are at 8.
Right. And I think it's important to note that while the media generally said that scores improved in 2023 from 2022 on the Kentucky summative assessments, in reality, they did in a majority of the areas, but there were some specific areas where they didn't do well at all. And in fact, fell in a number of places. For example, we saw in high schools in particular that the percentage of students scoring at or above proficient dropped or stayed the same at a low level for reading, where it stayed at 44%, which isn't very impressive, or mathematics, where it dropped from 36% to 33%, or science, where it dropped from 14% to down 10%. That's all in science. And in editing and mechanics, where it dropped from 46 to 44%. In fact, that's 4 areas where as high schools dropped. They improved a little bit in 3 areas only. So on average for the high schools, this is not a good performance. And this is continuing. We're supposed to start seeing recovery from COVID. And we did see some in the elementary and the middle schools. In the elementary schools, for example, there's only one area where the score stayed flat, and that was editing and mechanics. The others went up a little bit. And in the middle schools, 2 areas went down or stayed flat. Mathematics stayed flat. Social studies went down. So they did better than the high schools. But when you look at the percentages of students scoring proficient across the board, I don't see a single case for elementary, middle, or high school for any of the different areas reported where the percentage reached 50% proficient. Not for any subject, not for any school level in 2023.
Did they combine proficient distinguished into one category? Because that was two.
Yes, that is the way these scores I just talked are reported. It's called proficient and or distinguished added together. In some cases, in the report that I was saying, you'll see where they break it out specifically by those in novice, those in apprentice, those in proficient, and those in distinguished categories. But for these numbers I'm talking about, yeah, that's everybody proficient or more added together, and it's still less than 50%. That's not very encouraging.
And if you watch the school board meeting from, I think it was this past month, they were kind of bragging about the 40%, which is kind of disturbing.
Well, I don't think I'd brag about that. Would you? That's the problem. There's too much cheerleading and not enough. We're really not performing as well as we need to with the public school system. And they're very quick to cheerlead, very slow to point out, as I just did with high schools, hey, we've got major problems. It's getting worse or staying flat. And this is several years after COVID, when we are back at school. We're going to have problems for a long time. We're going to have problems for a long time. And I don't think things are getting good very quickly. One of the things that we watch a lot at the Bluegrass Institute, where I hang out, and I didn't mention that, but I'm a staff education analyst at the Bluegrass Institute. We look at the white minus black achievement gaps for proficiency pretty closely, because the black students in the state of Kentucky have been very, very poorly served by the public education system over the years. And that's not getting better. These gaps are significant, and they've been around for a long time. But in elementary reading, for example, in 2023 on the Kentucky Center of Assessment, 51% of the white students were proficient, but only 27% of the black students were. There was only about half of the proficiency rate for whites. And of course, they add it together, and that's what drags it down below 50% overall. In mathematics, this is elementary school again, 46% of the whites were proficient, but only 20% of the blacks. The worst area of the four that I look at with key academics are science. 39% of the whites were proficient, just 14% of the blacks were science. And again, into the high schools, science, just to let you know, it doesn't get better with age. 12%, can you imagine this? 12% of the white students were proficient in science, and only 3% of the black students were. The gaps are a serious, serious problem. They're not getting better. And the black students and the disadvantaged kids are the ones who are really, really getting left behind. It's just not acceptable. We've got to do better. Non-English, the non-English speakers haven't fared well either, although generally, in some cases, they will do better than the black students. In Kentucky, the black students are usually the lowest of all. The black students often tend to have proficiency rate scores down around the level of, are you ready for this? The learning disabled students. Yes.
Wow. That's
a serious, serious problem. Now, I mentioned that the high school proficiency rates weren't so hot earlier, and if anything, they're flat or going down. But somehow, despite that, proficiency rates for high schools in the 30s, 40s, and even down to 12% for science. The overall four-year graduation rate reported for the class of 2023 was 92.6%. Does that compute? No, it doesn't.
No.
And keep in mind, the black student proficiencies are significantly lower than the whites, but they managed to graduate 87% of the black students from high school. There's something seriously wrong with that. Absolutely inexcusable. You would have to take the position that either the test is much too hard, and if so, why? And is that really the case? Kids to graduation who don't know anything.
Are the teachers not teaching to the standard? Maybe they don't know because they're not allowed to look at the tests. I don't know.
Well, that's a good question. Technically, they're supposed to know what the standards are because the Kentucky standards for all of the subjects are published in a set of standards documents. There's a standards for every subject. The problem with those standards, however, is it doesn't tell us how good a performance is good enough. So they're not really standards at all. They're a framework. But the standards are supposed to have that information in them. That's a huge deficiency. And again, it's something where the education establishment is not managing their business properly.
Yep.
So no, nobody really knows what good enough is. And that's not the way a real high quality education system is run. This is a major deficiency with what we have going on right now. And the Kentucky standards are really terrible in many areas. My key focus right now for a while has been in social studies, and they are atrocious. Even though they had to do a change because the legislature was so upset that they forced them to add 24 key documents like the Gettysburg Address to the standards, because believe it or not, they weren't listed in there. When Kentucky's teachers were left on their own to create the standards, they didn't specifically require that kids would learn about the Gettysburg Address or a number of other things, really important stuff that the legislature said, gee, every kid should know this, and we're going to make it mandatory statewide. That just got added in, and so they went back and revised the standards to include that. And they put some other stuff in, especially for high schools that had not been there before. It should have been. But they still don't tell us how good a performance is good enough. So they're not really standards. But we're still graduating kids like crazy. That's wrong.
Right.
And employers have figured this out. Employers tend not to trust a high school diploma anymore. If there's any kind of academic requirement involved with what they do, they'll do their own testing. In fact, believe it or not, years ago, employers, because of this problem, went to ACT and they said, please create for us a test that we can give to prospective applicants for apprentice type jobs where we need to make sure they have at least minimal skills that we need in math and communications and reading and so forth. That's where the work keys tests that you may have heard of came from. They were created not for the school system, but for employers who knew they couldn't trust a high school diploma. And work keys, as far as I can tell, is still a going operation. Because you can't trust a diploma. The kids are testing only about 50% proficient, but you're giving almost every one of them a diploma anyway. It used to be that the Kentucky Department of Education up through 2019 would report the ACT scores for the public school graduates only. And ACT, the company itself, also puts out a report on ACT scores for each state, but they include everybody in that. It's public school, private school, and homeschool all added together. And I figured out a number of years ago, because they also listed the number of students involved, that I could compute a weighted average score with a little algebra for the kids in the non-public school category. And I did that up through 2019. There was no question that private schools outperformed the public schools in Kentucky. The problem is the Kentucky Department of Education stopped collecting and reporting graduate ACT scores after 2019. So here again, something we used to have is not there anymore. And to be honest, I don't think there's a good excuse for that. I think that's irresponsible. And shame on them. And maybe you guys can start generating some real heat on the department to realize that, hey, the public deserves to know what the post-school, high school graduating seniors average ACT scores, because that's different from what the 11th graders test out at. We cannot compare our 11th grade scores to scores for students in most of the rest of the country because they don't test all their kids in the 11th grade. And in states where they do test them in the 11th grade, they may not use the same testing schedule that we do, so they still may not be comparable. What we do know is, in general, scores go up between 11th grade testing and graduation. And we can see that with data we have here in Kentucky up through 2019. If you want to know what's happening in 2023, I can't tell you. I don't know.
Is that legislation? Is that a bill that has to be submitted?
It may take a bill to do it because the Department of Education clearly doesn't want to. It may be if you put enough pressure on the Board of Education. I think they would be within their powers and rights to require it. But with this board we have now, good luck.
Yeah.
They just sit there and let it happen. Since we're talking ACT, I can touch a little bit on what we do know. And this is about the 11th grade testing. If you go into this briefing packet I mentioned, there is a page that shows you ACT scores for the last couple of years. And I'm just going to talk about the composite scores, but they have them for all the 4 subjects as well. And there's no question that COVID hurt us, but we were in decline before COVID started. But you won't be able to see that in this report because they don't go back far enough for reasons I don't understand, unless maybe they don't want you to know that. The report covers the ACT composite scores for the 11th grade testing from 2018-2019 school year up through the latest 22-23 results. And in 18-19, the composite score was 19.0. That was the year before COVID hit. And in 23, it's down to 18.5. Now, it did come up 0.2 of a point from last year when it was 18.3, and it came up half a point from 2021 when it was 18.0. But that was in the middle of COVID. Testing was in chaos, and we didn't test all our kids with the ACT at that time. So that 2021 score, that's really iffy. I wouldn't really recommend putting much trust in it. But the 18-19 score is solid. And the latest one, the testing numbers are back up again. So we're down. But they didn't go back far enough. So I'll help you out. We'll go back a little farther. Remember I said that the score in 18-19 was 19.0? If you go back to 2016-2017, it was 19.8. Then it went down to 19.3 in 2017-2018. And then we came up by 2019 with a 19.0. ACT scores started to fall before COVID hit. And this one shows the percentage of kids meeting the benchmarks for not having to do remediation in college. These are the Kentucky Council on Post-Secondary Education ACT benchmark requirements. So you don't have to do remediation in college. And you can see the percentages here that met all 4 over in the far right column are pretty darn low. About 1 in 4 kids fully prepared for a college performance. And you can see again there that the high was hit in 2018, and it started dropping before COVID hit. They can't blame all of this on COVID. Look how low the percentages are for the kids that met all 4 subjects that are fully prepared for a real liberal arts college experience.
Oh my gosh, that breaks my heart.
Again, that's the percentage of kids who will be able to avoid any remedial courses in college in a Kentucky public university.
My question is, when did the Chromebooks get introduced? Because is that about the time where you see the percentages decrease? Because a lot of these kids are not able to learn through the Chromebook.
Program overall is not meeting the need.
Mm-mm.
And it started before COVID. They cannot use COVID as an excuse for all of the decay. That's very important to understand. This is only a 32-point test. When you lose that much on a 32-point test, that's a lot of kids that aren't meeting much anymore. It's a real, real problem. There are a number of different ACT reports out there. It's very easy to get confused, and I see people do that frequently. There is a report that ACT itself puts out. And they also have something, a website where you can build your own reports. That's sort of like the NAEP Data Explorer. You've heard about that tool, which has been around for a longer period of time. The scores that are in there are for all students in the state, public, private, and homeschool. It's very important to understand that because the private school scores pull the public school scores up a bit from where they actually are. And since 2019, we don't know where the public school scores are because the department hasn't released it. And ACT will not release that state level public only data on their own. It'll only come to us through the State Department of Education. Believe it or not, the top high school proficiency rate in the state was 81%. And it came from Pikeville High School, not Fort Thomas. In fact, Pikeville beat out the renowned DuPont Manual exclusive magnet school in Louisville by the better part of 10 points. DuPont Manual was 74% proficient. Pikeville was 81% proficient. So what's going on with that? But Beechwood was a little higher than Highlands, 65% versus 63%. So that's a little flip-flop from what we often see. Connor, over in Boone County, was only 52%. Ryle was 51%. Ludlow High School down on the water, 46%. Cooper, 45%. And over here in Kenton County, Simon Kenton, 42%. Walton Verona was way down at 39%. That's a real surprise. They usually do very well. Walton Verona only placed in 68th place for their high school math proficiency rate in 2023. If I was in Walton Verona, I'd be going to some board meetings and asking a lot of questions. The Dayton High School and the Dixie High School and the Scott High School, they all scored 35%, which ranks in around 100th place. I'm not real happy about that since I live in Kenton County, although that won't be for much longer. Newport High School, as usual, does pretty terribly, 16%, and they're down in 207th place. Lloyd High School didn't do so hot. They were 26% and in the 169th place. That's pretty embarrassing for Northern Kentucky, away from the water. And Holmes High School, 9% proficiency. That's 215 out of 217 high schools that had scores reported. A few schools, for various reasons, didn't get their scores reported. And to see Pikeville outscoring a bunch of schools, including everybody and his brother up here in Northern Kentucky, including some of our real top performers like Beechwood and Fort Thomas. Pikeville was very aggressive about getting their kids back to in-person after the governor's authority to mandate quarantine had been overridden by the legislature. The Laurel County elementary system went back in session as soon as the governor's hands were taken off it. And they said that they continued to get calls from the governor trying to pressure them into going back out remote. They refused to do it. And their test scores in 2022 were exemplary, despite the fact that they've got schools with 65, 75, and 100 poverty rates, well above state average, which is about 55, 58%. Well above. Because they got back in session quickly, because remote learning didn't work very well for kids. A lot of people, and I'm talking about a lot of people in education, do not understand this data very